Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Pearlie Brewer, and I will be your host. Today's podcast guest is Andrew Christie, who is the QSE manager at Brun-Way Highways Operations. Andrew is here today to talk to us about what it takes to keep everyone safe on the stretch of the Trans-Canada Highway from the Quebec border to Longs Creek, New Brunswick, which actually amounts to 275 kilometers. Certainly no easy task to try to keep people safe on a very, very busy stretch of highway. Welcome, Andrew. Great to have you here today.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Look, Andrew, let's start by getting to know a little bit more about you and your background. Why don't you tell us about your background and how you got involved in health and safety?
Okay. I started in construction about 1994 when I was a university student, and I was working for a small construction company located in Moncton, and we were doing like water and sewer jobs and items like that. And this was around the time when they were first starting to wear safety vests on general projects and stuff like that. And half the people acted like they were cats in sweaters and unable to move and can't really do much. And so I saw that, but as I went through university, I always seemed to keep returning to construction in some capacity. In 2005, I actually worked on the construction of the Brun-Way project, and it was like that was the most safety conscious project I had been on to date. And it was really interesting seeing the processes and the programs. I had an environmental position at the time, and just watching the safety officers do the work that they were doing and working with WorkSafe and all of the contractors. It piqued my interest. And so following the end of the Brun-Way project, I went to just a few different projects, but then I went on to a bridge project where I had an environmental position, but they also had a need for additional safety personnel. So I got involved in that and got a lot of training during that period. And from there, my career's kind of moved towards more the safety aspect of everything. And that's how I've kind of shifted positions to that. And then in 2013, I returned to Brun-Way on the operations side and have the position to this date.
Very good. You mentioned a moment ago when you started in the construction industry and what it was, a little bit of what it was like. What's the biggest change you've seen over the years from when you started?
People understanding that safety on projects is for their own benefit versus at the time it was seen as an obstruction from proper production on the projects.
Okay. Now, when we look at your Brun-Way work, it's, as I mentioned a moment ago, 275 kilometers from the Quebec border to Longs Creek. I put out a number of sort of questions to give folks a sense of how big your project actually is or how big your responsibilities are. And the first question I put out to you was the kilometers by highway covered, which I said was 275 kilometers. How many employees would you have in the summer?
In the summer, we have 55 employees approximately. It can vary a bit depending on the tasks that we have to do. One of the things I was also going to mention, included in our distance of highway, is a short section of the I-95 between Woodstock and the border of Maine. So we have Quebec border to Longs Creek and that little offshoot that runs to the border of Maine between Woodstock.
Okay, very good. Now, in the summer employees, what would they mostly be involved in doing?
Our summer employees, our main projects in the summer would be stuff like pothole repair, brush cutting, guide rail repairs, fence repairs. We also have mowing, general maintenance of the highway, litter picking, which is absolutely nobody's favorite. And we've always got stuff on the go and a lot of repairs. And depending on the year, we have certain inspections of highway infrastructure that we have to do every year. So our inspections can take weeks to complete, and they vary from like actual guide rail inspections for quality and condition of them, and culvert inspections just to make sure like no separated pieces, no no obstructions in them, not too much sediment in them. And so those inspections, along with other general assets, really take up a lot of time, and that helps develop kind of your plan for the summer on the repairs, like of our operations guys, of what we need to get accomplished during the summer period.
So how many employees would you have in the winter?
In the winter, we jump up to approximately 90, with that going up and fluctuating up and down depending on who stays. And at the start of every winter, we seem to have kind of a lot of hiring, but we lose a couple of people once they realize the job's a bit more difficult than they expect. And so, but in the winter, on average, we're shooting for about 90, between 85 and 90.
So what would those folks be involved with?
The winter people, general maintenance, like the guide rail repairs and other stuff that you can do in the winter, but mostly the reason we have the jump is to meet our plowing obligations and all of our winter operation obligations to keep the road safe for the motoring public.
Okay. Now, when it comes to projects on the go, as you drive this stretch of highway, like many other highways in the summer, you see a lot of different projects on the go. How many of those would you have on the go at any one time? Or I should say maybe even over the summer.
Yeah, through a season, we would have 10 to 15 projects on the go. And these are your larger projects. They don't include our actual operations work. These are more of your rehabilitation work, which would include asphalt, microsurfacing, structure repair, line painting, and items like that.
Okay. Now, as far as your winter activities, to go back to that for a second, how many plows would you have on that stretch of highway in the winter?
We have 28, and that includes probably a couple of spares in there, because just like any machinery, there's an expectation when it gets work hard, we can have breakdowns. So we like to keep spares available, so there's not a big disruption to our services that we provide, so we can get back out onto the highway as soon as possible, even if we do have a breakdown.
Now, when it comes to winter, of course, lots of salt being applied as well as salt brine. How much salt would you go through on that stretch of highway during the winter?
I took a quick look, and last year it was a bit of a high year where we put down approximately 20,000 tons.
Wow.
Yep. And for brine itself, we used about 1.3 million liters of it.
Okay. And you also still use some sand, I believe?
Yes, because what's been happening, we'll have I don't know how much you've been watching the winters, but we'll seem to have a rain event mixed in with immediately fast dropping temperatures. So to keep the traction, we've been using sand frequently, which also is mixed with a low percentage of salt. And last year we used about 6,000 tons of sand as well.
Wow. Now, for folks that may not be familiar with it, let's just go through a little scenario where, let's say, a couple days from now, we're going to be seeing a combination snowstorm and ice storm, which we seem to see a lot of these days, as you mentioned. What's this process you go through to get ready for that storm and to determine, for example, when you would use salt, when you would use salt brine, whether or not you would use sand?
With that, we have what's called road patrollers. And we have all of our key staff trained as well. But the road patrollers receive training on completing winter maintenance and salt best uses or best management practices, when to use, how much to use, how to read weather forecasts, and also using local information that they can collect to make the decisions that they need to on the work that they're doing. And so it's their training that really helps make the decisions on that. We will have a pre-storm meeting if we know that we're having a mixed bag of weather coming in, where we talk end to end between management and the key players about what the plan is and what their intentions are and how they're going to hit it. Because a lot of the weather forecasts, they can give you approximate times when stuff are starting and when they're going to finish. And the real key is when you see changes of temperature and items like that, where if you see the temperature is going to be rising immediately following the snowfall, you can make choices based on that. But if you see the temperature is going to be dropping off shortly after, say you had wet snow mixed with a bit of rain, the choices that the road patrollers need to make are very different than what they would in that scenario.
So temperature-wise, how much does that guide what you put down on the road as far as salt, brine, or sand?
A very high amount, because if you see that the temperature is dropping throughout the day, your surface temperature is dropping quickly throughout the day, there's times where you'll want to make sure that your salt's on to try to get the icy conditions. But if you see that it's dropping too far, you may opt against using salt at all, because all that's going to do is melt what's on the surface and potentially create like a super bond of ice. So once the temperature's down, then you won't be able to remove what gets packed on, and you won't be able to address the ice that you've inadvertently created, and we'll have to switch to sand. So every little nuance in all of this leads to the decisions that the road patrollers make, and they're much more well versed on the exact decisions and reasoning for the decisions they make at their time. And they have a lot of responsibility with that, and that's why we try to make sure that they're well trained and confident in their choices, and they're looking kind of further down the line as opposed to like the immediate situation outside of a flash freeze or something to that effect. But they know the decisions they make can have a longer impact potentially on the next person that comes on if they make a short-sighted choice and it ends up being incorrect for the temperatures and what they are doing.
Now, everyone always jokes about weather in Atlantic Canada, about how quickly it changes. How do you folks deal with that? If I'm looking forward or looking ahead to a storm, I go on the Weather Network and they'll say one thing. I go on Environment Canada, they'll say another. Maybe AccuWeather says something else. How do you folks stay on top of that and the changing conditions?
Well, a lot of us still do all of that, but we also have a organization hired like that are weather forecasters as well. So we receive updates multiple times a day on the expected weather. So our guys, I think, through the winter constantly scroll through the different weather apps, and then they use the forecaster that we have to help make decisions. But we've also got multiple vehicles with road temperature sensors.
Okay,
and
good.
Using that, they just kind of make their decision by like accurate on site. And we also check the cameras frequently, but that has more to do with deployment, like with it's called RWIS, so Road Weather Information System, like your highway traffic cameras that you can see. Mm-hmm. And our guys use those for reference as well. So they try to combine everything into their decision making to make sure they make the most accurate decision they can with the information provided.
Now, when do you use salt brine?
We use salt brine whenever possible because it helps the salt activate more quickly, and it also helps prevent salt bouncing off the road. I don't know if you've ever seen people spreading like just dry salt on a road and you're wondering how much of it's actually staying on the road versus going in the ditch. So salt brine helps it stick. But there's also like a temperature where we stop using it because we don't want to add any more liquid to the situation and create slippery conditions. So salt in itself, like your general rock salt, its effectiveness starts to decline quickly at about minus 11. And it's not effective, I think, below minus 15. These are all just numbers by memory. And so that also factors into our choices, because if we know that it's going down beyond that point, all we're doing is putting material on the road that's not going to be doing anything until the temperature starts rising, which could be a few days away or...
Now, to go back, I guess, a bit, what is salt brine?
Salt brine is honestly just a mixture of water and salt. And so we have a machine that correctly manufactures it, because your targeted percentage by memory is like 22.5 to 23% salt. Okay. So we have our system that we have is a portable trailer. So we bring it to one of our locations, hook up water, puts salt into the hopper, and then it processes it through, and then the output would be salt brine at the proper percentage, and then we fill up our tanks with it. And then once they move on, we use those tanks to fill up our plow trucks and our tow plows, so it's readily available to them at the proper percentage. And it's the percentage itself is very important that you keep around there so it works the most effectively.
So while we're on the topic of winter driving and winter safety, I guess you could say, what's your biggest challenges that you guys face when it comes to keeping your staff safe during the winter and obviously keeping the motoring public as safe as possible as well?
In all honesty, our biggest challenge all year around, and I think you'll find this from any company who works in or near traffic, but our biggest challenge remains the motoring public. And so our guys and any winter maintenance company, they're out there with probably, they feel a lot of obligation to the local communities they work in, and they do their best for the conditions that we have. But at the same time, we're trying to keep the road open for the motoring public, and sometimes they're our biggest obstruction and our biggest hazard because not everybody pays attention to the need for winter tires. Not everybody adjusts their driving for the conditions. Not everybody has patience when they come across winter maintenance activities, and they try to force themselves through, which impacts kind of the population as a whole, because you're impacting the ability for any winter maintenance company to do their job effectively, and then you get a less safe road from these activities because they have to take evasive maneuvers to try to adjust and avoid any incidents that may occur. And after the motoring public, our biggest risk would be, say, working in the worst conditions. When people are told to stay home because of winter conditions, that's when that's our big time. That's when people have to be out. That's when we're doing our best. And also we have whiteout conditions, so the guys are having a hard time seeing, but they still have the section of road to address that they did when the visibility conditions were better. So working in the worst conditions and also working in the worst condition results in kind of an increase of the potential for slips, trips, and falls. So really those are kind of like another big concern with our guys, because they are out there in terrible conditions and slips, trips, and falls, whether it's getting into and out of your vehicles, walking across the yard, fueling, reloading salt and sand. Slips, trips, and falls always remain a high potential for us.
Now, I've a number of times driving on the Trans-Canada in the winter, I've come across a situation where I'm behind two plows, driving side by side, clearing the roadway. What's the proper protocol for what I should do there? Should I keep back and wait until a certain time? What's the proper protocol?
Yep. What we would hope everybody does is just have patience, because realistically what we're doing, and so we plow to the right. Other organizations do it a bit different, but all of our snow, we plow from the left, the passing lane, to the right, over to the shoulder, and into the right-hand side ditch. So when you encounter the two plows, the one in the passing lane is passing snow over to the one in the driving lane, and we use tow plows as well, so when it goes to the driving lane truck, it goes all the way over to the shoulder. And so with it, just patience, because realistically, if you're behind a plow, it may develop into about, say, 10 minutes behind it extra to your traveling time. But the plows are there improving the conditions for you, where if you try to force your way through, that 10 minutes may result, if you push through, you're in the ditch and now you're a few hours behind where you'd like to be. So patience is a virtue, and I know a lot of, you'll see kind of town and rural plows that have a sign on the back of them, keep back 30 meters. Mm-hmm. And that should be just a good rule of thumb for everybody, because the conditions ahead of our plows is not good. Otherwise, we wouldn't be out there.
Now let's go back for a second to summer challenges. What are the biggest summer challenges that you face?
I was going to say I hate harping on the same thing, but our year-round challenge is the motoring public. And in the summertime, we set up our projects and all of our activities based around traffic control.
Mm-hmm.
And traffic control's only as good as people adhere to it. So we do everything according to the Work Area Traffic Control Manual, which is the traffic control manual for the province of New Brunswick, and it's put out and managed by the Department of Transportation. And it's easiest way to put it, it's a book of instruction and figures on how to do traffic control as safely as possible to keep the motoring public driving as unobstructed as possible, yet keeping all employees as safe as possible at the same time. And that's why anywhere in the province you should see similar traffic control setups for similar situations. And so once we can get traffic dealt with, that's where our guys can be more comfortable with their activities. However, the issue is a lot of people don't follow traffic controls like speed reductions. We have people who hit the candles on the highway because they're not paying attention, whether they're distracted or just unaware of the width of their vehicles, and they just seem to ignore the traffic control around them. We've encountered multiple hazardous situations where I don't think people realize that the people working there, if you're driving a car 100 kilometers an hour plus, if you lose control, some of these people wouldn't have seconds if that were to, like an incident were to occur. And so people reducing speed, the speed reductions there for their safety and for the safety of people working on the highway. And so once we get that, like the traffic control side dealt with, it again is slips, trips and falls, manual material handling hazards, general ergonomic hazards, where it's hard work that they do on the highway, especially in the summer. And I think you've seen probably over the last few summers where we have more humid days, more high humidex days. So heat illnesses become a real concern. And then the guys taking frequent breaks, whether it's in the shade or air conditioned vehicles, because shade's hard to come by on a highway. So it's also like monitoring each other to make sure for heat related illnesses that there's no, usually you can catch things when you're watching each other a bit where someone starts acting a bit different. And so that becomes like another great risk of ours. But as always, most everything when you're working on an open road, it's the motoring public is always your biggest concern.
Now, I would assume from what I'm seeing on the highway that, especially when it relates to the Trans-Canada, or I should say specifically as it relates to the Trans-Canada Highway, you will not see any flaggers, traffic control persons, signalers out on the Trans-Canada Highway. Generally, you use other mechanisms to try to control traffic because of the speed.
Yes, we try to avoid flaggers in all scenarios. There's a couple of oddball issues that'll come up very rarely where flaggers will be required, but that's items that we don't really get into. But I believe there's an item where if you're putting lines across the highway, which would be outside of us because we're not into putting lines across the highway, but like there's exceptions, like if there was a need for blasting, traffic would have to be stopped. So flaggers may be involved, but I believe they're looking at approving something called, like, I think they're not robot flaggers, but they're automated flaggers, where it's instead of people, it's an actual machine that they can use. But the only time we ever get into flagging is if we're working on like an intersecting road, like an overpass or something like that. So we may need flaggers for short duration work on something like that. But on the highway, it's just not safe to have somebody out there.
So what do you do then to control your traffic rather than the flaggers? What kind of mechanism?
We don't, essentially we don't stop them.
Mm-hmm.
We try to keep traffic flowing, because if you can keep traffic flowing at an easily understandable route that they're directed in a positive manner through, that's usually the safest for the employees and the motoring public. You may see flaggers on occasion on the highway if there's an accident scene, but they're more to slow down and they avoid trying to stop anybody because that in itself sets up almost like an accordion effect.
Mm-hmm.
And if there are traffic being stopped for an accident scene, that's because they've got to put a tow truck across the highway to try to retrieve something out of the ditch. But as much as possible, we do not flag on the highway at all.
Yeah. Now, traffic numbers. If I take a little trip from Fredericton up to Grand Falls or Edmundston, lots and lots of traffic. Can you give folks a sense of how many vehicles you might see or might go through that stretch of highway in the run of a day?
Yes, I tried my best to see what numbers I could get for before this podcast, but they're hard to retrieve because they come out in kind of a complicated fashion. But it's approximately 9,500 vehicles per day that would be using our section of road. Okay. And it's getting busier. And as you would expect, it fluctuates throughout the year with us having high numbers, especially through the weekends in the summertime. And then in the winter, it kind of goes back a bit where it's less passenger vehicles than in the summer, and it's more about being a transportation corridor.
Yeah, one of the things I curious about is the number of transports. So if you're looking at 9,500, for example, roughly as the number of vehicles per day, what percentage of that traffic would be actual transports?
If we did an average through the year, it'd probably be between 50 and 70%. And that was an estimate from our road patrollers and some of our field personnel on how they saw traffic and what they've observed throughout the year. So it's not like an exact number from the traffic counters that are set up on the highway, but what our guys actually see.
What challenges do transports present compared to other motor vehicles? Do you see anything that sort of stands out or anything your guys would tell you about that?
That's a bit of a difficult question because transports, you still have people that are distracted driving. They just have a larger, more dangerous vehicle when they do it. Mm-hmm. You have a variety of capabilities, just like you do in a passenger vehicle. So some people that have been truckers their whole life have different experience, skill set, and capabilities than somebody who's just getting into the industry. And one of the concerns that some of our personnel have mentioned to me is the prevalence of automatic vehicles and people using cruise control in poor weather, mm-hmm. where just like a passenger vehicle, cruise controls for optimal conditions only. Once weather, whether it's rain, icy conditions, or anything else, cruise control shouldn't be used. And so they have great concerns about that, whereas before you had like your basic, like standard transmission in a truck, and a lot more people were like, you'd have to shift the gears, you would have to make the adjustments, where the automatic transmissions are doing the work for people, so that can lead to back to the distraction because they have less activity to do on while they're trucking. So that's just what we get from talking to our guys, and a lot of our personnel are previous transport drivers and tasks like that, so they have experience in that world.
So I think it's pretty safe to say that distracted drivers are a big issue of concern, not only transports, but all vehicles. That pretty much a correct statement?
Oh, very much so. And if you look at some of the newer vehicles, they're coming with giant screens that will kind of change a bit while you drive, and it creates distractions that weren't there previously, where you'd have your old adjustable radio in some of the older cars and nothing too exciting on the dash and no great entertainment available to you. But distracted driving it's created kind of a situation where we're just hopeful that people are going to move on from it. I don't see how they could, and with the enforcement, we occasionally will get enforcement blitzes on speed and traffic zones, and they look for distracted driving, of course. It's just a very difficult thing, I think, for the enforcement agencies to they have to catch them immediately at the time. And if there are motor vehicles accidents, it's also hard to prove after the fact that it was distracted driving that led to the accident that may or may not have occurred.
So a couple of questions relative to vehicle speeds. Speed limit on the Trans-Canada highways, 110 kilometers an hour. Based on the experiences I've had, if you go 110 kilometers an hour, more often than not, unfortunately, you can have a sense that you might get run over.
Yep.
I assume that the high speeds that you tend to see on the Trans-Canada highway must be a real concern to your staff.
Yeah, when you couple it with all of the other factors like distracted driving, varying capabilities, you don't know how a person maintains their vehicle and all of those items, but it gets really noticeable when you go into a traffic control setup where general lane reduction is permitted to 20 kilometers an hour. So if it's 110, you can drop it to 90. Otherwise, you need special permission from DTI. So if we've got to drop to 90 kilometers an hour and you see a car actually going through that traffic control at 90 kilometers an hour, you will see a bunch of cars like getting right back up to them because they've slowed down to 110 to go through the traffic control if we're lucky. And it's just, people don't seem to appreciate how important reducing speed to the posted speed limit is in the traffic control zones and just on the highway in general.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question. You probably don't have the answer for it, and that is, when you reduce your traffic speed in a construction zone from 110 to 90, whatever, what percentage of drivers do you think actually slow down to the speed that you're recommending?
That would vary, because a lot of times you will have, say, people from out of province that come through that will reduce it because they have more regular enforcement out. And so when they're expecting there to be enforcement agencies right on site at almost every traffic control, you'll see quite a few reducing speed. And one of the hiccups that we can encounter is if you have traffic control up for an extended period, as time passes, a lot of the locals will reduce their speed less and less and then just return to the normal speed limit because they're used to it and they're used to what's going on. So realistically, we're probably about 40 to 50% of people who would reduce their speed for traffic control zones. One of the good things is anybody who works in the industry of like construction or paving or anything like that, normally you'll see them reduce their speed because of the fact like they know what it's like to be out there.
Now, last Friday, I went from Fredericton to Moncton, and going to Moncton and coming back, there were at least a half a dozen locations where all the signage is in place indicating that during certain hours construction will be going on, but I don't see any construction. And after I don't see construction in one site, I go down the highway a few kilometers. I see a similar setup indicating there's construction. I don't see anything going on. Then I go to a third one and the same thing. Do you think there will come a time where when it comes to zones that construction is not currently taking place, that there might be some signage in place to let people know? Otherwise, people start to, nothing going on here, so the next one I come to, I don't think I need to slow down. Is there a better way? I know it's tough for you. Obviously, you can't keep taking signs down and putting them up in cones and so on. So yeah, for long projects, you have to put them up and they stay there. But sometimes if they're not in use, actual construction going on, people might tend to say, well, if it's not happening here, why should I believe it's happening down the road?
And see, what people, I guess, will need to understand is the hazard still exists. So what you would see is stuff like, especially if you had, it doesn't occur much on the highway, but if you had a construction zone on a bidirectional road, so like a 2-lane highway, you'll see all of the traffic control signs remain in place. But if you had flagmen, when they're not in use, they're supposed to be turned, and that should be an indicator to the motoring public that there's a change. So the flagman ones are turned, and once flagman's return, they're turned to face traffic again. And so there are little things like that. I don't know if they'll make big changes to show that, because really it's one set of signs that you would turn because the hazard still exists. And most of the motoring public aren't catching on to all of the detailed signs. They're looking at the main ones like construction ahead, no passing. So if there's one sign that's changed, a lot of people wouldn't even register that fact between the difference between an active work zone and one. There's hazards that still exist, so the signage has to remain in place for the safety of the motoring public. And so that one sign change is just not going to get caught on, so people will think everything looks the exact same, even though there may be signs changed or turned in the locations where it's inactive.
Now, I'm sure there may be folks out there that are driving on the highway, especially in the summer. They'll see all this work going on and they'll have questions about, how much planning goes into you folks getting ready for a construction season, especially in the summer months. You have different projects on the go. Talk to folks or talk to me a little bit about what all is involved from the point of view of planning for a construction season, so to speak.
Really, and I think all organizations are the same. Like, our planning for projects is kind of never ending because we have a long-term asset management plan, which basically lays out how long, say, a section of asphalt has been in place and when it should be rehabbed. And then we do inspections. So we look at our long-term plan and we do inspections of all assets, and that helps plan the work that you've got coming up. So it just seems to be never ending, where you've got an idea from one year to the next what you're planning to have done the next construction season. And then through inspections and everything else, really in January, we start putting the plan together on what's going to happen the upcoming season. And that's based on like your long-term asset management plan, your inspections, our internal inspections, third-party inspections that we have done. And if something's deteriorating more quickly than it was expected to, it gets bumped up the list into the current construction season. Otherwise, we can kind of stick with the long-term planning. And once January hits, the engineering department's putting a lot of effort into where they're going to have the investments made in the rehabilitation projects. And then by about March, they should have a lot of the bids ready to put out. And they go out, and work normally varies between starting. You could start some stuff in April, but normally we're looking in May, June, July, August, your general regular construction season.
So advice for motorists in the summer, what would you suggest?
I can't remember the wording of, so Department of Transportation, the Road Builders Association, I think NBCSA put out like a blitz every summer. Mm-hmm. You may see it where it's like, slow down, my mom works here, slow down, my dad works here. Yeah. The message doesn't change. Like, you have to realize that there's people working in these traffic control zones, whether it's on the highway, whether it's on the back roads, and your attention is the most important thing that you can give, and following the directions of the traffic control, because you're making yourself safer, and you're making the conditions for the workers safer. And when we drive vehicles, I find, like myself, after you drive for so many years, you're complacent to the fact that you're handling a very heavy machine that could be a projectile that could quickly change the lives of several individuals if you're not paying attention and driving to your full capabilities.
Winter drivers. Advice you would give to winter drivers.
Have good tires and slow down and drive for the conditions. That's about the easiest way to put it. Everybody should plan to have like an emergency kit in their vehicle. I think there's, I'm blanking on the name of it, but the emergency response organizations always seem to have suggestions on what you should have in your vehicle as a safety kit for the winter time. And that could be just as simple if you end up sliding into a snowbank, or if there's like a snow squall that comes through that you end up kind of stuck until people can plow you out. Like, everybody should have an emergency kit in their vehicle and make sure that it's appropriate for the conditions and things to keep you warm. I believe they also suggest that you have water, a flashlight, booster cables, and a small shovel. I know some of them will suggest like a bag of kitty litter in your trunk in case you wind up on an icy road and you can't get traction. And kitty litter or sand will function on the road to give you traction.
So to conclude, what's your biggest challenge as a health and safety professional? in your job?
Complacency. It's our guys. We're a long-term project, so we're different than a regular construction company. Our project goes, I think it was 28 years long, so we've got some long-term employees. So if you're standing out on the road and traffic is whizzing by, if you're not used to it, it's a scary feeling. We have employees that they're very, very used to it. So they're kind of complacent to the risk posed by traffic. And they get frequent reminders, but it's like anything, like I mentioned earlier about driving a vehicle. You get complacent with the fact of how much you actually have to do to keep yourself and others safe. So after complacency, before complacency, it's the motoring public is the scariest part of my job. And then it's the complacency of our employees. And then everything else below that would be kind of your task-specific risks and hazards, where we do some work at heights, but it's very infrequent. So working at heights isn't that top of mind. That it is when the situation is there, but it's not kind of our more apparent risks and hazards.
Look, Andrew, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us on today's podcast. You certainly have a tremendous job that you need to be doing. When I look at the traffic on the highway, when I look at the speeds, I look at our weather conditions that keep changing, and in the winters we seem to be getting more of this, a lot of rain, freezing rain, snow mix, more so than just snow. That presents, I'm sure, a lot of challenges. You certainly have a tough job ahead of you. So thank you very much for appearing today on our podcast. Keep up the good work, and I'm sure as you keep going and you keep pushing health and safety, that will certainly see a safer highway.
Well, thank you for having me on here, and I just wanted to kind of thank all of our employees for all of the good work they do, and also anybody who's involved in winter maintenance activities. I know you've got an uphill battle coming, but everybody can do their best, and hopefully the motoring public will appreciate the work.
As is always the case, we would appreciate your feedback on today's podcast, as well as ideas for future podcast guests. You can always reach me at pearlybrewer@gmail.com. Stay safe. See you next week.